He was used to being watched, not doing the watching. But Alexander Vance, tech tycoon and solitary billionaire, found himself that evening leaning back in the leather seat of his blacked-out Range Rover, his eyes fixed on a figure ahead, Amara, his maid. 26. Quiet. Consistent. Too consistent, perhaps. She had asked to leave early that day, something she'd never done before. And when he'd overheard her whispering on the phone, something in her tone, a sense of urgency, secrecy, had needled at him. He wasn't paranoid, just calculated. A man didn't build a billion-dollar empire by trusting blindly. So he followed her. Amara walked briskly, taking alleys instead of Main Street. No stop. No distractions. She wore the same modest uniform, carrying a worn satchel that sagged with weight. The contrast between her world and his was more than visual, it was atmospheric. Every block seemed to shift the air, from sanitized marble lobbies to cracked pavement and flickering neon. She finally turned into a narrow side entrance behind what looked like a failing public hospital. No signage, no security, just a rusted door and peeling walls. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but curiosity pulled harder than pride. Inside, the place smelled of bleach and despair. The lighting was dim. No security cameras in sight. He moved quietly, unseen, as Amara disappeared through a swinging double door labeled Pediatric Ward. What was she doing here? Volunteering? Meeting someone? He followed. And then he saw it. Amara sat beside a small hospital bed, holding a frail boy's hand. The child's chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow gasps, tubes snaking out of his nose. She adjusted his blanket, whispering something he couldn't hear. But her voice was gentle. Her body, still after a long day of labor, radiated a steadiness that didn't match fatigue. A nurse passed by and smiled. "You're early today." Amara smiled back, tired but warm. "He had a tough morning." "Still calling you Miss Hope?" the nurse asked. "He refuses to call me anything else." She laughed softly. "So I guess I'm stuck with it." Alexander stood frozen in the shadow of the hallway. "Miss Hope." The boy stirred, twitching in distress. Amara immediately moved closer, placing her palm on his chest and humming softly, an old lullaby, the tune uncertain but comforting. Slowly, his tiny limbs relaxed. The monitor beeped rhythmically. Alexander had come looking for proof of betrayal. Instead, he found her holding a life together. For the next hour, he stayed hidden, watching as she moved from child to child, feeding, combing tangled hair, gently washing hands. She never checked her phone, never looked bored, never asked for thanks. There was no camera here, no audience. It unsettled him. He was a man who understood cause and effect, inputs and outputs. But here she was, expending energy without return, giving without demand. He couldn't compute the logic, couldn't ignore the shame tightening in his chest. He remembered the times he had passed her in the hallway without so much as a nod, when he spoke to her only to issue instructions. Never once did he ask where she went after scrubbing his dishes. Never once did he imagine she was scrubbing pain from dying children's faces too. He left before she saw him. Back in the Range Rover, he sat motionless, headlights off, heart unsettled. This wasn't what he expected. He was Alexander Vance, data-driven, calculated, always one move ahead. Yet somehow, he had underestimated the woman folding his shirt. His phone buzzed. A board member. He ignored it. Another buzz. An alert about a potential acquisition deal. He swiped it away. Instead, he searched the hospital's name. It had no official donation page. No corporate sponsors. A footnote in the healthcare system. Forgotten. He scrolled until he found a poorly made crowdfunding campaign that had raised barely $200 in 4 months. He stared at the screen, then closed it. His gaze drifted back to the hospital entrance. Amara hadn't come out yet. He imagined her still inside, comforting children whose parents had abandoned them or who had no one to fight for them. He wondered when she would sleep. He wondered why he didn't know. The next morning, Amara returned at 6 a.m., just like always. She made his breakfast, folded his laundry, and cleaned the marble floors with care. Not a hair out of place, no sign of fatigue, no plea for acknowledgement. She placed a coffee beside him on the veranda, just as she did every morning. "Anything else, sir?" she asked. He looked up. Her face was calm, neutral, waiting. He wanted to ask 100 questions. Why the hospital? Why the kids? Why hadn't she told anyone? But all he said was, "No. That's all." She nodded and turned away. He watched her walk down the hallway, now seeing not a maid, but something else entirely. Something unshakable. Something he hadn't realized was missing in his own reflection. Ask ChatGPT. Alexander didn't sleep that night. The image of Amara in that hospital ward played over in his mind like an unfinished loop, her hand on the boy's chest, the smile that wasn't performative, the calm in a place full of fear. It wasn't pity that unsettled him. It was revelation. He had misjudged her entirely. By noon the next day, he had made up his mind. He called his driver, gave specific instructions, and was dropped off a few blocks from the hospital. No security, no announcement, no suit, just a plain jacket and silence. He entered through the same rear entrance Amara had used, keeping his head down. The same bleach-stale air greeted him. He moved through the narrow hallways until he found her again, crouched beside the same boy's bed. She had a book open, reading softly. The boy was alert today, eyes fluttering, a weak smile on his face. She made exaggerated voices for each character, the kind that made children forget they were hooked to tubes. A woman passed him, clearly another volunteer. She paused, noticing him, but said nothing. He stepped back, leaned quietly against the wall. A nurse walked up and spoke in a hushed voice, not recognizing him. "You knew?" "No," he answered. "Just visiting." The nurse nodded. "She's been coming here for a while. 3, maybe 4 times a week. Never misses. Brings snacks when she can afford it. Sometimes just sits and holds hands." Alexander's voice came quieter than he expected. "She works full-time, too." "Yeah," the nurse replied. "We told her to rest. But she says resting doesn't help the kids." A child across the ward cried out in pain. Amara immediately rose, walked over, and knelt. She didn't speak. She just let the child bury his face into her shoulder. That was it. No miracle. Just presence. Alexander's chest felt hollow. He stayed longer than he meant to, eyes tracking her movements, observing what couldn't be fake. There was no performance, just care. And none of it was owed to him or anyone else. When he left, he made a donation under a false name. $5,000 routed anonymously to the hospital's barebones fundraiser. It wasn't guilt. It was instinct. He watched from a distance the next evening as Amara walked into the pediatric wing and found the hospital director waiting. The woman held a letter. Amara read it, paused, and shook her head. "She thinks it's a mistake," the director said, laughing. "But we assured her it's real. You should have seen her cry." Alexander didn't move. He didn't step forward. He didn't want thanks. He just wanted to see what hope looked like in someone else's eyes. That night he walked into his own house differently. The chandeliers felt excessive. The quiet was no longer peaceful. Every piece of luxury now looked like insulation from a world he had ignored. He began researching quietly. The hospital operated on emergency government grants and volunteer labor. Its equipment was outdated. Its medicines nearly expired. And yet it housed over 50 children a month, most from abandoned or impoverished families. He read every word of the campaign page, typed by someone clearly unfamiliar with marketing. A desperate plea lost in the noise of the internet. Over the next few days, Alexander began arriving earlier at the hospital. Sometimes he helped stack boxes. Sometimes he cleaned without being noticed. He wore a hoodie. Stayed anonymous. No cameras. He watched Amara teach a 5-year-old how to tie a bandage on a teddy bear. He saw her fix a child's hair and braid it with beads. He listened to her speak gently to a dying girl about what dreams felt like. She never asked for recognition. She never told anyone she was doing it. One evening, as he wiped down the side of a bed, he caught her looking at him. Just for a moment. A flicker of confusion passed through her expression. But she said nothing. He looked away and left before she could follow. He knew the question would come eventually. At home, he found himself making changes. He told his staff they'd receive a week of paid leave every quarter. He canceled an unnecessary office renovation and redirected the funds to medical equipment. No one questioned him, but the shift began to ripple. He pulled financials from the hospital records, quietly helped wipe off debt. He found a supplier willing to donate hygiene kits monthly. He met with a pediatric doctor who had once left the hospital due to underfunding and offered to pay her salary for a year if she returned. Still, he hadn't spoken a word to Amara about it. It wasn't shame. It was uncertainty. He didn't know how to confess that the woman he had once suspected of stealing his silverware had unknowingly redefined his understanding of wealth. On the fifth night, as he helped unbox a delivery, she approached him. "You've been here a lot," she said softly. He paused. She knew. "I suppose I have," he replied, keeping his eyes on the box. She didn't ask why. Didn't press. She only nodded. "We're low on blankets again. I'm going to check storage." He offered, "I'll come." She hesitated, then gestured for him to follow. They walked through the corridor in silence, two people tethered not by status but by circumstance. Inside the storage room, amid crates and rusted shelves, she finally turned to face him. "I thought you were following me that night," she said. "I wasn't sure." He didn't lie. "I was." She nodded slowly. "Did you think I was doing something wrong?" He met her eyes. "I didn't know what to think. But I wanted to find out." She let out a breath. "Well, you found out." "I did," he said. "And I haven't stopped thinking about it since." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just grounding herself. "Why are you still coming?" "Because I didn't know people like you existed," he answered. "And now I can't look away." She studied him carefully. "I'm not special. I just try. You're the only one who ever did." She said nothing. Just opened a box of blankets and handed him a stack. They worked together in silence, folding, sorting, organizing. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not power. Not class. Perspective. Alexander didn't return to the office for 3 days. His assistant called. Board members emailed. Meetings were rescheduled. But none of it pulled him back. He spent the days in silence, observing, volunteering, and listening. He no longer stood apart from the world Amara lived in. He stepped fully into it. For the first time in his life, he saw need without filters. Children with no shoes. Parents who visited once and never returned. Nurses working 12-hour shifts with tears dried onto their cheek. He used to think charity was writing a check. Now, he knew how wrong that assumption was. Amara never questioned his presence again. She accepted him quietly, assigning him small tasks without praise or skepticism. He swept. He carried. He listened to children describe their dreams like they were promises instead of fantasies. The more he listened, the more his shame grew. Not because he had once suspected her, but because it had taken him so long to look. Back home, the distance between him and his old life grew. His marble kitchen felt sterile. The living room that once represented achievement now echoed with loneliness. The automated lights, the curated art, the soundless silence, all seemed like ornaments for a man who thought he had built a kingdom, not realizing he had built a cage. He began sleeping less. Not from stress, but reflection. At night, he'd pull up spreadsheets of his companies and stare at the lines, the numbers, the sterile reports. None of them told the truth he'd just started to understand, that nothing he had ever created served people like Amara. Curious to know more, he asked a friend to quietly dig into Amara's history. Not to violate her privacy, but to understand the path she had walked. The report was brief. No online footprint. No social media. No formal college degree. Just high grades from public school, an incomplete college record, and several minimum wage jobs that never lasted long. The kind of resume that never even makes it to a hiring desk. But there was one note that caught his attention. She had enrolled in a pre-med program 8 years ago. Dropped out in the second semester. No explanation listed. The next morning, he waited until the hospital shift ended. When Amara stepped out, she looked surprised to see him there, standing with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed her one without speaking. She took it wordlessly and began walking. He followed. They stopped by a rusting park bench. "I didn't mean to pry," he said. "But I found out you were once in pre-med." Her shoulders tensed for the first time in days. "That was a lifetime ago. Why did you stop?" She hesitated. "My mother got sick. We didn't have insurance. I worked 2 jobs and still couldn't cover her medication. One day she just didn't wake up." She stared into the distance. "I dropped out the next day. Couldn't keep up. Couldn't afford it." He let the silence settle. "Did you want to be a doctor?" he asked. "I still do," she replied. "Every day." He looked at her. "Then why haven't you tried again?" "I don't have the luxury of second chances. People like me aren't given time to dream twice." The words hit harder than he expected. They were not bitter, just honest. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his notebook that night and began planning something new. Not for profit. Not for headlines. But for purpose. He contacted the hospital administrator. He asked for budget breakdowns, funding gaps, staff needs. He spoke to former employees who had left because they couldn't survive on volunteer hours. He listened to a janitor describe how he couldn't afford his daughter's schoolbook. Then he went to his office, pulled his company's discretionary budget, and made quiet reallocations. A line item labeled Executive Retreat vanished overnight. A brand partnership fund dissolved. No one noticed. In their place, an anonymous fund appeared under a nondescript foundation name. It began paying off medical debt. It bought new beds. It installed working radiators in the pediatric wing. The hospital changed slowly but visibly. Amara noticed but never asked. She just smiled more often. Worked longer. Brought in other volunteers from her neighborhood. She told him once, "If they see someone care, it gives them permission to believe." That line stuck with him. One afternoon, he watched as a new girl walked in, barely 16, trembling. She wanted to help, but didn't know how. Amara gave her gloves, a sponge, and instructions. Within minutes, the girl was helping clean a child's wheelchair. Afterward, Alexander approached Amara. "You turned her into a volunteer in less than 5 minutes," he said. "No," she replied. "She already had it in her. I just gave her permission to act on it." He realized then that leadership didn't come from power. It came from making others feel powerful. That night, he drafted a proposal for a new program, one that would provide training, certification, and paid work for hospital volunteers. Not flashy, not corporate. Just practical. The kind of solution that would never trend online, but would change lives quietly. He submitted it to the board of one of his subsidiaries under a generic name, framing it as a community outreach tax offset. They approved it without a second glance. The first to be enrolled? Amara's younger brother. He was shy, clumsy, and unsure at first, but he showed up every day. Within weeks, he became the most efficient orderly on the floor. Amara cried when she found out. Alexander didn't comfort her. He just nodded and kept walking. She knew. He knew. That was enough. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no headlines. But things shifted, quietly, completely. And Alexander, once a man obsessed with output and metrics, now understood the value of invisible change. Ask ChatGPT. It started with a man in a cheap suit waiting outside the hospital, leaning against a dented car, arms crossed, cigarette burning down to ash. Alexander noticed him during one of his late visits, standing too close to the exit, eyes tracking every nurse, every volunteer. He didn't fit. The next evening, he was there again. And the one after that. On the fourth day, the man approached Amara as she stepped outside. His voice was low but firm, and though Alexander couldn't hear the words, he saw the tension snap into her shoulders. She didn't argue. She didn't run. She just nodded quietly and walked away. The next morning, she arrived to work with a split lip and a stiffness in her step. She moved slower but said nothing. Pretended like it hadn't happened. Alexander didn't confront her. Not yet. But he began digging. The truth surfaced quickly. The man was a debt collector tied to an underground ring, one that didn't wait for court orders or call centers. Her mother, long before passing, had borrowed from them to pay for medications, betting on the hope of recovery. She never lived long enough to repay it. Amara inherited the burden, quietly, without complaint, because there was no one else to carry it. Over the years, interest tripled. She paid what she could, working 3 jobs at times, dropping out of college, selling furniture, skipping meals. The hospital wasn't just a place she volunteered, it was a sanctuary from the rest of her life. Alexander sat alone in his study, the report spread across his desk. Each payment record, each signed threat, each humiliating invoice, was more damning than the last. And yet, she never asked for help. He called in a favor, an old friend from law enforcement. Within days, the debt enforcers were reported for extortion. 2 were arrested. Amara was never mentioned in the official complaint. He made sure of it. When she arrived at work and realized they were gone, her expression didn't change. She simply stood still, as if waiting for another storm to begin. Later that night, Alexander found her alone near the supply room. She didn't look surprised to see him. "They're gone," she said quietly. He nodded. "They won't come back." She looked at him, eyes tired. "Did you do it?" "Yes." She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She just stared. "I didn't want you to see that part of my life," she whispered. "I needed to," he replied. "So I could understand the weight you carry." Her voice cracked. "Everyone thinks kindness is easy. But you try waking up every day knowing people want to collect a debt from your grief." He stepped back, letting her speak. "You try showing up for kids in pain while you're wondering if your brother has enough to eat tonight. Try folding laundry for someone who doesn't know your last name while you memorize every corner of the cheapest pharmacy aisle." The silence stretched. "I kept going because if I stopped, the whole thing would collapse. And people like me, we're not allowed to collapse." Alexander took a breath. "That's over now." She shook her head. "No, it's not. Because even if the threats are gone, the system that let them exist is still standing. People like me always carry it." He wanted to argue. Instead, he listened. She continued. "You want to help? Don't just fix it for me. Fix it for the people who don't have a millionaire following them." He didn't reply. Because she was right. That night, he contacted every executive within his company and subsidiaries. He compiled the salaries of janitors, receptionists, kitchen staff, positions often ignored. The wages were shamefully low. Worse, many were contractors with no benefit. Within a week, he launched an internal reform, restructured wage floors, added health coverage, removed contractor loopholes. HR fought back. So did finance. But he didn't budge. Then came backlash from his peers. CEOs and investors whispered about his sudden interest in low-level labor. His inbox flooded with warnings. One board member outright told him he was risking the company's reputation. He responded with data. Turnover rates dropped. Staff productivity increased. Lawsuits diminished. Shareholder value stayed steady. But none of it mattered as much as what happened at the hospital. More volunteers began showing up. Some were former patients. Others were strangers who heard whispers about what was changing. A new coat of paint appeared on the walls. More children were being admitted because now there were resources to treat them. Amara still showed up every evening unchanged. She still folded towels, still wiped counters, still listened to every child like they were the most important person in the world. One evening, she asked Alexander why he kept doing it. He answered simply, "Because I don't want to be the man I used to be." She didn't ask who that was. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, she shared more of her story. The scholarships she couldn't accept because they didn't cover food or rent. The professors who offered sympathy but no solutions. The jobs that hired her because she smiled, but fired her when she needed a day off to attend her mother's funeral. She never told the story for pity. She told it to show how many cracks exist for people to fall through. Alexander listened to every word, absorbing the details that never made it into polished reports or interviews. For the first time in his life, he saw poverty not as a result of laziness or bad choices, but as a labyrinth, one that required relentless stamina just to survive. And Amara had survived it with dignity. Quiet, unbreakable dignity. He realized then that changing her life wasn't enough. He needed to dismantle the systems that made her story the rule, not the exception. So he kept going. Not out of guilt, not for redemption, but because someone had once followed a path with nothing to gain, and gave everything anyway. Ask ChatGPT. The invitations were sent without logos, titles, or explanations. Just a date, a location, and the phrase, "Hope isn't a luxury." The guests were handpicked. Business leaders, philanthropists, journalists, and quiet changemakers. No one knew what to expect. It was Alexander's design. Let them arrive with questions. Let their assumptions do the work. He rented out an old cultural hall near the hospital. Nothing extravagant. No red carpets. No orchestras. Just a clean, warm space filled with photographs of children from the hospital, smiling, sleeping, surviving. Each picture had one line beside it. "She sat beside me when no one else would. He held my hand through the pain. She told me I mattered." None of them were signed. But they didn't need names. They only needed truth. Alexander took the stage with no introduction. No applause. Just presence. He didn't begin with statistics or budget. He didn't name-drop. He simply told a story. He spoke about a woman who arrived to clean his home at sunrise and then left to heal children by sunset. A woman who endured threats, worked through grief, and still chose kindness without being asked. He didn't name her. Not yet. He described the night he followed her, driven by arrogance and mistrust, only to be dismantled by what he witnessed. He admitted his failures, his blindness, his assumptions, and then he turned the lights down and a short video played, silent footage from inside the hospital. Volunteers folding linens, kids being read to, nurses smiling behind masks. No narration. Just moments of quiet, persistent humanity. When the lights returned, there were tears in the room. Alexander cleared his throat and said, "I thought I knew what impact meant. I was wrong." Then he revealed the purpose. The launch of the Hope Initiative, a permanent foundation aimed at identifying and supporting frontline community caregivers like Amara. Funding their education. Paying them dignified wages. Giving them legal support and mental health care. He didn't ask for donations. He asked for participation. You don't have to applaud people like her. You just have to make sure they don't burn alone while the rest of us stay warm. The response was immediate. Guests approached him not with offers of money, but with time, space, and resources. Lawyers offered pro bono support. Schools offered partnership. Tech leaders pledged internships and training. In a corner, Amara watched in stunned silence. She had come only to deliver medical supplies, unaware of the event's purpose. When she realized what it was, she tried to leave. But Alexander stopped her gently and said, "You should hear this." She stood in the back, listening to strangers speak about her without knowing her name. listening to the ripple her quiet actions had created. After the event, people approached her one by one, asking who she was. She simply said, "I help where I can." The next day, the story began to spread. A few journalists who attended wrote op-eds titled "The Maid Who Changed a Millionaire." Others called her the Unknown Angel. Her face never appeared. That was her request. Let them see the work, not the worker. Alexander honored that. But he made one change. The newly renovated pediatric wing at the hospital now had a small brass plaque near the entrance. It didn't bear her name. It read, "This space exists because someone showed up, quietly and relentlessly. If you're reading this, you can be that someone too." The hospital saw a 60% increase in volunteers within 3 weeks. Supplies doubled. Former patients returned to help. Meanwhile, Alexander implemented sweeping reforms in his companies. He introduced a rotational leadership program where executives spent a full week each year working entry-level jobs inside and outside the company, cleaning, delivering, caring. It wasn't symbolic. It was contractual. Refusal meant termination. At first, there was pushback. One VP threatened to resign. Alexander said, "Go ahead. But understand that people like Amara clean your offices, feed your children, and wipe your parents' mouths in care homes. If you think you're above that, you're unfit to lead." The board shifted. Culture changed. Slowly. But undeniably. Amara continued her work without letting any of it change her rhythm. She still volunteered nightly. Still brought her brother to tutoring sessions. Still handed out food packs to parents in the hospital who hadn't eaten all day. One afternoon, Alexander found her in the break room, sitting alone. He sat beside her. "They want to nominate you for a national award," he said. "I'm not interested," she replied. "You deserve to be recognized." "I don't do it for recognition." "I know. But maybe someone else needs to see that people like you exist." She looked at him. "Then let them meet the kids. They're the ones who kept me going. I just stayed because they had no choice." He nodded. "What if I told you the foundation is expanding to 5 more cities? I'd say you're learning to multiply miracles." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried exhaustion and pride in equal parts. That evening, he reviewed the latest data reports from his HR team. Absenteeism dropped. Retention improved. Job satisfaction scores rose across departments. He realized then that change wasn't a department, it was a decision. And one woman had made that decision, quietly, long before he ever noticed. She hadn't asked for a stage. She had just shown up, every single day, and held someone else's world together while hers was falling apart. Now, the world was beginning to hold her up, not with applause but with action. And that, Alexander thought, was what real transformation looked like. Ask ChatGPT. The headlines hit harder than expected. One tabloid ran a story titled "Billionaire Fixated on Maid Sparks Company Turmoil." Another called him a PR addict chasing poverty porn. Some blogs twisted the Hope Initiative into a vanity project. Others questioned Amara's identity, accusing her of manipulating a powerful man. Within 48 hours, Alexander's board called an emergency meeting. Half of them wanted a statement, the other half wanted a retraction. All of them wanted distance. They told him to disassociate publicly. They suggested hiring a crisis manager. One even suggested replacing Amara at the foundation with someone less controversial. Alexander didn't flinch. He let them finish. Then he spoke, calmly and without performance. "I'm not cutting ties," he said. "And if that costs me everything, so be it." The room went silent. He added, "You all praise leadership when it makes you money. But leadership means standing in the fire when it gets uncomfortable. This foundation isn't about optics. It's about doing what should have been done years ago." They tried to argue revenue. He countered with values. They brought up investor fear. He replied, "Let them be afraid of conscience for once." After the meeting, resignations trickled in. Not many. just enough to send a message. He didn't stop them. He knew the difference between team members and passengers. The backlash extended to the hospital. Donations stalled. Some previous sponsors threatened to pull out unless the made story was silenced. One company revoked a grant, stating concerns about associating with a non-professional figure. Amara received threats online, people questioning her education, calling her a fraud, a manipulator, even a political plant. She never responded. She simply kept working. Alexander offered to take her off the public record, move her to a private role. She refused. If I disappear now, what message does that send to the next woman who's invisible until she becomes inconvenient? He knew she was right, but the tension wore on her. Quietly, in the lines under her eyes, in the moments she hesitated before entering the hospital, she worked harder than ever, as if proving herself to people she'd never meet. Alexander hated that part the most, how the world forced those already doing the most to justify themselves. He made another decision. This time, without a press release. He began meeting with leaders of small local organizations, ones that had been ignored for years. Soup kitchens, shelters, immigrant clinics, re-entry programs. He listened, asked what they needed, and quietly connected them with the foundation. No announcements, just action. He also redirected his personal assets into a blind trust, one without his name attached. From that trust, full scholarships were created for hospital volunteers who wanted to study medicine, nursing, or counseling. He named the scholarship after Amara's mother. When he told her, she didn't speak for a full minute. Then she whispered, she would have liked that. But the attacks didn't stop. An anonymous source leaked payroll records, showing that Amara's hospital stipend had increased under Alexander's influence. Social media called it favoritism. He faced the cameras for the first time in months. No PR team. No notes. He said, if paying a woman fairly for the emotional labor she's done for years without recognition is controversial, then controversy is overdue. The clip went viral, but not in the way he expected. Nurses started posting under the hashtag #WeAreAmara. Janitors, caregivers, single mothers, people who had gone unseen, shared their stories. The conversation shifted. No longer about a billionaire and a maid. It became about what society deemed worthy. It became about the lie that titles equal value. And in that wave, something cracked. A major news network did a full segment on Amara's work, without dramatics, without intrusion. Just her, speaking about the children, the hospital, and the dream that kept her going. Building a care system that didn't punish the poor for being tired. Donations returned. Quietly, steadily. Other hospitals reached out, asking how they could adopt the Hope Initiative model. Alexander met with policymakers, urging wage reform for caregivers. He didn't go as a CEO. He went as a man who had once followed a woman out of suspicion and found a mirror instead. The final blow came during a televised roundtable. A fellow CEO accused him of undermining merit-based success by platforming low-skilled workers. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He simply said, if you think scrubbing blood off floors while soothing a dying child isn't skilled labor, then your metrics are broken. The audience clapped, not because he was rich, but because he was right. After the broadcast, Amara texted him for the first time. Just 5 words. You finally said it aloud. He replied, because you lived it first. The war wasn't over. Systems don't change overnight. But something had shifted permanently. Not just in headlines, in hearts. Because one woman refused to be invisible, and one man refused to let her stand alone. Ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT said, the first graduation ceremony wasn't held in a university auditorium or streamed for press. It took place in the hospital courtyard, under paper lanterns and plastic folding chairs. The graduates were not dressed in caps and gowns, but in scrubs, name tags, and hard-earned smiles. They were the first class of caregivers trained under the Hope Initiative's Quiet Revolution, former patients, volunteers, part-time workers who once believed dreams like doctor or nurse belonged to other people. Amara stood at the edge of the group, not as a guest of honor, but as a constant. She didn't speak from a podium or accept flowers. She handed out the certificates, hugging each recipient, whispering personal messages only they could hear. She knew every journey, every sacrifice behind each smile. Alexander stood in the back, arms crossed, a rare expression of contentment on his face. Not pride. Something quieter, deeper. A recognition that legacy wasn't about names carved into stone but seeds planted in others. He watched the people Amara had nurtured step forward into futures once closed to them. When it ended, no music played. People stayed. They talked. They shared food. A few cried. Most laughed. One child, barely tall enough to reach the buffet table, tugged on Amara's sleeve and handed her a drawing, stick figures holding hands beneath the words, "Miss Hope saved us." Later that night, Amara and Alexander sat on the hospital roof under a quiet sky. She looked out over the city, the glowing buildings, the distant sirens, the alleys that had once swallowed her in silence. "You know," she said, "I used to think survival was enough, just making it through the day. I didn't think there'd be anything after that." "You built what comes after," he said. "You just didn't have the tools at first." She nodded. "And you gave them to me." "No," he replied. "You taught me why tools matter." They didn't need to say more. Some things were already understood. In the weeks that followed, the Hope Initiative expanded again. New partners joined quietly. Schools that offered night classes for single parents, food programs wrapped into medical schedules, mental health counselors stationed in waiting rooms. The model was built not to impress, but to work. It was a blueprint for dignity. Alexander declined every interview, every award, every honorary title. He redirected them to the people on the ground. The ones who stayed past their shift. The ones who picked up the phone when no one else did. The ones who, like Amara, gave long before anyone watched. The corporate world noticed. Not all embraced it. But the pressure shifted. Companies began reviewing internal structures. Not for image, but because the labor force had found its voice. Employees demanded transparency, livable wages, and ethical practices. They had seen what change looked like when it stopped performing and started building. Amara continued her quiet work. She enrolled in night school again, this time fully funded. She didn't tell anyone until she passed her first exam. Alexander only found out because she left a textbook on his desk, open to a page about pediatric inflammation. No note. Just a red underline. He didn't mention it. He just sent her a new laptop. She never said thank you. She just used it. That was their language now, action over acknowledgement. When her brother was accepted into college, she hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. She had given him a life she never had, without debt collectors, without fear, without the weight of sacrifice before adolescence. Change didn't come in applause or headlines. It came when a child got breakfast before medicine. When a mother slept in a real bed beside her sick daughter. When a janitor had health coverage for the first time in his life. When a volunteer didn't have to skip meals to give time. It came in the invisible, repeated acts of decency that built a structure no storm could flatten. Years later, when Alexander's name faded from business magazines and his fortune split into quiet trusts and silent grants, a young journalist tracked him down, not for scandal or gossip, but for understanding. She asked, "Why did you follow her that night?" He paused. "Because I thought she was hiding something," he said. And she was. A level of humanity I hadn't known existed. The journalist leaned forward. "And why did you stay?" "Because once you see it," he replied, "you either ignore it forever, or it changes every part of you." She nodded and closed her notebook. She didn't ask more. The story was already whole. In time, Amara became a licensed pediatric counselor. She still worked at the hospital, still volunteered beyond her hours. She trained others, mentored quietly, And every year, on the anniversary of her mother's passing, she lit a single candle in the ward and left a handwritten note. We made it. She never became famous. She didn't need to. But the hospital, once crumbling, once forgotten, became known across the country. Not for its donors, but for its heartbeat, for its culture, for being the place where no one was too small to matter. Visitors often asked about the plaque at the entrance, the one that read, "This space exists because someone showed up, quietly and relentlessly." They'd ask who it was about. The staff would always smile and say, "We all are." Because by then, the story was no longer hers alone. It was a movement, a memory, a mirror, a reminder that the most powerful change doesn't begin with noise. It begins when someone chooses to stay, even after the world stops watching.